My name is Sarah Novak and I was 36 years old, standing in a hospital corridor on the third floor of Saint Benedict Medical Center, holding a paper cup of cold coffee, when a security guard approached me and told me I was no longer permitted in room 318. My husband was in room 318. He had been there for 6 days. He had been unconscious for 4 of them. I had spent those 4 days in the chair beside his bed, learning the rhythm of the monitors the way you learn the sounds of a house you have lived in for years, each beep and shift and change a sentence in a language I had taught myself out of necessity and love and the specific terror of not knowing. The security guard was polite. He had the expression of a man following an instruction he found distasteful but had decided was not his to question. He told me that the patient's next of kin had requested that my access to the room be restricted and that hospital policy required him to honor that request. The patient's next of kin. My husband's mother was 64 years old. She had driven 4 hours the previous afternoon with my husband's brother Paul and Paul's wife, and they had arrived at the hospital in a formation that told me, before anyone said a word, that they had discussed the drive and the plan and the outcome they intended before they got in the car. I looked at the security guard. I looked at the door to room 318. I looked at the paper cup in my hand. Then I asked the guard to wait 1 moment. I took out my phone. I called a number I had been given 3 days earlier by a woman I had not expected to be important and who turned out to be everything. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not to the corridor, not to the security guard, further back, to a marriage that was good and a family that was complicated and a man who understood both of those things more clearly than anyone gave him credit for. My husband's name was Daniel Novak. He was 39. He was a civil engineer who built bridges for a living and who had the specific patience of someone who spends their professional life thinking about load-bearing capacity and the consequences of getting the calculation wrong. He was methodical and warm, and he laughed at things twice, once when they happened and once later when they came back to him, and the second laugh was always bigger than the first. He had been mine for 11 years and my husband for 7 of them, and I knew him the way you know someone when you have chosen them every day for a long time. He also had a family that had never quite decided what to do with the fact that he had chosen me. Daniel's mother was a woman named Irene Novak. She was not unkind in the simple sense of that word. She was the more complicated kind of difficult, the kind that presents as love and operates as control. She had raised 2 sons alone after Daniel's father left when the boys were young, and she had done it with a ferocity and a sacrifice that were real and that she had never fully stopped collecting on. Daniel was the older son. He had been, since the age of 12, the man of the house in a way that nobody had asked him to be but that Irene had needed him to be, and the two things, what was asked and what was needed, had blurred long before I met him. Paul was 34 and had learned early that the path of least resistance in the Novak family ran directly through Irene's preferences. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had optimized for a specific kind of peace and had been paying the cost of it his whole adult life without calling it by its name. I had been in Daniel's life for 11 years. In those 11 years, Irene had been consistently, persistently, and creatively opposed to the specific shape my presence took in her son's life. Not to me personally, or not only to me personally, to the version of Daniel that existed when I was with him, which was more independent and less available and less organized around her needs than the version she had raised and preferred. She had never done anything I could point to cleanly in a single conversation and say, this is the thing. It was always smaller than that and larger than that simultaneously. The holiday that required us to choose. The family decision that was made without us and presented as settled. The way she spoke about our apartment when we bought our house, and the way she spoke about our house when we renovated it, always with the specific tone of a woman who is measuring something against a standard she has not disclosed. Daniel knew. We talked about it the way couples talk about the things that are true and not fully solvable, with honesty and without resolution, because some things in a marriage are not problems to be fixed but whether to be navigated. He loved his mother. He also saw her clearly. The combination of those two things was, I think, one of the most exhausting things about being Daniel Novak, and he carried it with a grace that I did not always fully appreciate until it was gone. He got sick in January. Not suddenly. The way these things go, the way the body announces something it has been doing quietly for longer than you knew, with a symptom that seems minor and then a test and then another test and then a conversation with a doctor who uses the word concerning and then the word significant and then the word immediate. By February he was in treatment. By March the treatment was working and then it was not, and the conversation with the oncologist shifted in the way those conversations shift when the first plan has been exhausted and the second plan is harder and carries less certainty. Daniel handled this the way he handled everything. He gathered information. He asked the right questions. He made decisions based on what he understood rather than what he hoped. And he did something else, something I did not know about until later, that I will get to in the right order because the right order is the only way this story makes sense. I want to tell you about the the 6 days at Saint Benedict because they are the center of everything, and because the 6 days do not make sense without the context, and the context does not make sense without the 11 years, and so you need all of it before the corridor becomes what it actually was. Daniel was admitted on a Monday with what his oncologist described as a treatment complication. His condition deteriorated over the first 2 days in the specific way of someone whose body has been working very hard for a very long time and has finally reached the limit of what it can sustain without help. By Wednesday he was sedated and on a ventilator, and I was in the chair beside his bed learning the monitor sounds. I called Irene on Tuesday evening, before the sedation, because Daniel had asked me to. He had been specific about this. "Call my mother," he said. "Tell her what is happening. Tell her she can come." His voice was tired in a way that went past the physical. I called her. She thanked me for calling in a tone that told me nothing about what she was planning. She arrived Thursday afternoon with Paul and Paul's wife Sandra, who I had always found kind in the quiet way of people who have learned to survive by observing carefully and speaking minimally. They came into the room in sequence. Irene went directly to the bedside. She held Daniel's hand. She spoke to him in a low voice that I could not hear from the other side of the room. Paul stood near the window. Sandra sat in the second chair that the nurses had brought in and caught my eye briefly with the expression I recognized from our few direct conversations, the one that meant she was sorry and could not say so. We existed in that room for 2 hours in the specific silence of people who are all in grief and none of whom are in the same grief. Then Irene asked to speak to the doctor. The doctor was a hospitalist named Dr. Reyes who was covering the evening shift. Irene asked him, in a voice she used for transactions, what the process was for medical decision-making when a patient was incapacitated. Dr. Reyes explained the process, which in our state meant that the patient's designated healthcare proxy held decision-making authority. Irene said she was Daniel's mother and his next of kin. Dr. Reyes said he understood and that he would need to review the patient's file before having a further conversation about that subject. I heard this exchange from across the room. I heard it and I understood it, and I felt the specific cold of understanding something you have been hoping you would not have to understand. I had signed a healthcare proxy with Daniel. We had done it together, in an attorney's office 2 years into his diagnosis. I was his proxy. He was mine. I knew this, but knowing a thing and having it tested in a hospital corridor by a woman who had spent 11 years deciding she had more claim to her son than I did were two different experiences, and only one of them required paperwork. That night, after Irene and Paul and Sandra had gone to their hotel, I sat in the chair beside Daniel's bed and I held his hand and I talked to him the way I had been talking to him for 4 days, about nothing important and everything important, about the garden that needed attention and the documentary we had been planning to watch and the specific thing he had said to me on the morning before the admission that I was not going to repeat here because it belongs to me. And I told him what I had heard, what Irene had asked, what it might mean. I do not know if he heard me. The doctors said maybe. I choose to believe he did. The next morning, Friday, I arrived at the hospital at 7. I went to the nurse's station before going to the room because I had developed the habit of checking in with the overnight nurse before starting my day, a small ritual that had made me feel slightly less like a person adrift in a situation I could not control. The overnight nurse that morning was a woman named Patricia who had been on the unit for the 4 days I had been there and who had the specific warmth of someone who understands that her job is only partly medical. She told me that Dr. Reyes had left a note in Daniel's file the previous evening requesting that his attending physician, a woman named Dr. Miriam Osei, review a specific document in the patient's records before any discussions about healthcare proxy or medical decision-making authority took place. I asked Patricia what document. She said she did not know the specific, but that Dr. Osei had been in early and had already reviewed it and that she had asked to speak with me when I arrived. I want to tell you that I felt calm in that moment. I did not. I felt the specific sensation of a person standing at the edge of something large without knowing whether the ground continues or drops away. Dr. Miriam Osei was 51, a hospitalist and palliative care specialist who had been Daniel's attending since his admission. She had the quality that the best physicians have, which is the ability to be completely present in a way that makes you feel, even in the worst moments, that the situation is being held by someone who can hold it. She found me at the nurse's station and she said, "Mrs. Novak, there is something I need to show you. Can we speak privately?" We went to a small family consultation room, the kind with soft chairs and a box of tissues on the table that you never want to need. Dr. Osei sat across from me. She had a folder in her hands. She set it on the table between us and she said, "Your husband left this with me at his last outpatient appointment 3 weeks before his admission. He asked me to keep it and to give it to you if a situation arose in which you needed it." She slid the folder toward me. Inside was a document and a letter. The document was a healthcare proxy designation, executed by Daniel 2 months after his diagnosis, witnessed and notarized, naming me, Sarah Novak, as his sole healthcare proxy with full decision-making authority. It was not the one I had signed with him in the attorney's office 2 years earlier, though that one existed too. This one was more recent. document. It included a specific addendum, written in Daniel's own hand and attached to the legal document, that addressed a scenario he had clearly thought about carefully. The addendum stated that in the event of his incapacitation, his healthcare proxy designation was to be upheld regardless of requests from family members, that his mother Irene Novak and his brother Paul Novak were to be permitted hospital visitation but not medical decision-making authority, and that if any dispute arose, this document and the accompanying letter were to be provided to the attending physician and, if necessary, to hospital legal counsel. He had thought about this. He had anticipated this. He had prepared for this the way he prepared for everything, methodically and with the specific care of a man who understood load-bearing capacity and the consequences of getting the calculation wrong. The letter was 2 pages. His handwriting. I want to tell you what it said, but some of it I cannot tell you because it is mine, and some of it I cannot tell you because it is his, and the combination of those two things is a private thing that lives in a folder in my desk and does not belong to a story, even this one. What I can tell you is that he said he knew what his mother was capable of, that he loved her and had spent his whole life loving her, and that loving her had never once required him to pretend he did not see her clearly, that he had made his choices about his life with his full understanding of everyone in it, and that the woman sitting in the chair beside his bed for 4 days was not a visitor in his story. She was the story. He also said something practical, in the way he always balanced the personal with the practical, which was that if I was reading this letter it meant something had happened and that Dr. Osei had his complete trust, and that whatever came next I should listen to her and trust the process and not be alone in it. I read the letter twice in that small room with the box of tissues on the table. Dr. Osei sat across from me and did not say anything, which was exactly right. Then I folded the letter. I put it back in the folder. I looked at Dr. Osei and I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Now I speak with the family, and I want you to be present for that conversation." She said it in the tone of a woman who has made a decision and is not asking for permission. I said, "Yes. Have you ever had someone prepare for you so thoroughly that their preparation arrived exactly when you needed it and not a moment before? Tell me in the comment." I read every one. Subscribe so you are here for the part that Irene Novak did not anticipate, because the conversation that followed in that hospital room is the one I still think about when I need to remember what it means to be loved carefully. Dr. Osei asked the family to come to the consultation room at 10 o'clock that morning. Irene arrived first, which told me something. She was dressed for the day in a way that suggested intention. Paul came behind her with Sandra close at his shoulder. They settled into the soft chairs with the specific arrangement of people who have had a conversation about who sits where. I was already in the room when they arrived. I had chosen a chair that placed me beside Dr. Osei rather than across from the family, which was not an accident. Dr. Osei had suggested it. She understood rooms. Irene looked at me when she came in. Her expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise that I was there. Something harder than surprise. Then the managed version of her face returned, the one she wore in transactions. Dr. Osei began. She thanked everyone for coming. She described Daniel's current condition in clear clinical language, which was serious but stable. She explained the care plan. She answered 2 questions from Paul about specific medical details with the patience of someone who understood the questions were really about something else. And then she set the folder on the table. She said that before any discussions about medical decision-making could proceed, she needed to share something that Daniel had left in her care. She said it was standard practice for her to honor patient directives in situations like this one, and that Daniel had been explicit and specific about his wishes. She slid the healthcare proxy document across the table. Irene looked at it. She read the first page. She read the addendum. The room was quiet in the specific way of a room where something has just changed and everyone is recalibrating. Then Irene said, "This was written when he was not well. He was not thinking clearly." Dr. Osei said, "The document was executed 8 months ago, witnessed by 2 individuals and notarized. His oncologist, who was present at the appointment where Daniel delivered this to me, has confirmed that Daniel was cognitively intact and fully oriented at the time of signing. There is no clinical basis for a capacity challenge." Irene said, "I am his mother." Dr. Osei said, "I understand. And you are listed here as a permitted visitor with full visitation access. This document does not remove your ability to be with your son. It designates his healthcare proxy for medical decisions." Irene looked at me. It was a long look, the kind that is trying to do something with the weight of it, trying to make the person on the other end of it feel the thing she was feeling, which was the specific anguish of a woman who had spent 39 years believing her claim on her son was absolute and had just been shown, in a legal document in his own handwriting, that her son had thought about her claim and made a different decision. I looked back at her. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the document had not already said in cleaner language than I could have used. Paul said, "We just want what is best for Daniel." Dr. Osei said, "I understand. And I want you to know that is exactly what we are all here for." She paused. "The document is clear. Mrs. Novak is his proxy. That is the framework we will be operating within." That was the conversation. For sentences was from Dr. Osei, one from Paul, one from Irene. That did not change anything. And the folder on the table between us with Daniel's handwriting on the addendum and his signature at the bottom. After the family left the consultation room, I sat for a moment alone. Not crying, something quieter than crying. The specific stillness of a person who has just been held up by something they did not know was there. I went back to room 318. I sat in the chair beside Daniel's bed. I held his hand. The monitors made their sounds. I told him what had happened. All of it. From the folder to the consultation room to Irene's face when she read the addendum. I told him Dr. Osei had been everything he said she would be. I told him the document had done exactly what he built it to do. I told him he had gotten the calculation right. I do not know if he heard me. I choose to believe he did. The days that followed were hard in the way that hospital days are hard when someone you love is fighting something large and the outcome is uncertain. I will not give you false resolution on that because the story does not allow it and because the truth of what happened next is more complicated and more real than a clean ending. Daniel came off the ventilator on day 9. He was conscious on day 11. He came home on day 17. His recovery took 8 months. 8 months of a different kind of work than either of us had done before. The slow methodical rebuilding of a body that had been through something enormous. He was patient about it. Of course he was. He was the man who built bridges and understood load-bearing capacity and knew that the right calculation required more time than the urgent one. We did not talk about the hospital room immediately. There were more pressing things. But we talked about it eventually, on a Saturday afternoon in October, sitting on the porch of the house with the garden that had needed attention, which I had attended to in the months while he was in treatment because tending to something living was the only thing that had kept me from dissolving entirely. I told him about the corridor, the security guard, the paper cup of cold coffee, the phone call I had made. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew she would. That is why I talked to Dr. Osei when I did." I asked him when he had written the letter. He said 3 weeks before the admission. He said he had not told me because he had not wanted me to spend the preceding weeks anticipating the worst. He said he had trusted Dr. Osei to hold it until it was needed and to use her judgment about when that was. I said, "You trusted a lot of people with a lot of things without telling me." He said, "I trusted you with everything. The rest was logistic." That was the most Daniel Novak sentence he had ever said to me, and I have thought about it every day since. I want to talk about Irene because I think the story requires it and because my honest account of what happened afterward is more complicated than the version that would be satisfying to tell. In the weeks after Daniel came home, Irene did not call. This was unusual. Paul called once to ask how Daniel was recovering and was warm and brief and did not mention the hospital room. Sandra sent a card that was handwritten and genuine and which I kept because the handwriting told me she had thought about what she wanted to say. Irene called 6 weeks after Daniel came home. I answered because Daniel was sleeping and because the call was going to happen eventually and I had decided, somewhere in the 8 months of recovery, that I was not interested in prolonging the waiting. She asked how Daniel was doing. I told her. She asked about his next appointment. I told her. She said she hoped to visit soon. I said she was welcome to come when Daniel felt ready for visitors and that I would let her know. Then she said something I had not expected. She said, "I would like to talk to you. Not about Daniel's health. About the other thing." I said I was listening. She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that in Irene meant she was looking for the version of the sentence that cost her the least. I had learned to recognize it over 11 years. What came out of it was not what I expected. She said, "I was afraid." She said it simply, which was not how Irene usually said things. She said, "When I got to that hospital and saw him and understood what was happening, I was afraid and I did not know what to do with it, so I did the thing I have always done, which is to try to control something. And you were the thing I tried to control." It was not an apology exactly. Irene was not built for apologies in the complete sense, but it was honest in a way that her honesty rarely was, the specific honesty of a woman who has seen something about herself in a mirror she did not choose and has decided to acknowledge it rather than look away. I said, "I understand fear. I was afraid too." She said, "I know you were." We talked for 20 minutes. Not about the hospital or the document or the security guard or the consultation room. About Daniel. About the things we both knew about him that the other one did not. She told me something about his childhood that made me understand a specific quality of his patience that I had always known but never known the origin of. I told her something about his second laugh, the bigger one that came later, and she laughed herself, the genuine kind, and said yes, that is exactly him. It was not a transformation. I want to be clear about that because the story wants to be a transformation and it is not. Irene and I are not close. We are not what we were, which was two women managing their proximity to the same man with varying degrees of grace. We are something more honest than that and less comfortable than that, and I think we are both still deciding what to call it. What I can tell you is that the following Christmas, she called to ask what I thought Daniel might want. Not what the family should give him, but what I thought he would like. She asked me the way you ask someone whose opinion you have decided to actually use. I told her. He was very pleased with the gift. He laughed at it twice. Daniel went back to work 11 months after his discharge. Not full full-time immediately, part-time and then full, rebuilding the way he rebuilt everything, with the attention to load-bearing capacity that was the organizing principle of his professional and personal life. He is back on his projects now. He comes home in the evenings with the specific tiredness of someone who has been doing something they love with their whole body. The second laugh is back. It was the last thing to come back and the first thing I noticed when it did. I have thought many times about what he did. The appointment with Dr. Osei, the document, the letter, the precision of the preparation. He had not known for certain that any of it would be needed. He had simply understood that it might be and had done the work to prepare for the possibility, quietly, without telling me, because telling me would have required me to live in the possibility before it became necessary, and he had decided that was not something I needed to carry in advance. He carried it instead. He added it to the list of things he carried, the load-bearing capacity calculation he had been running on himself his whole life, and he carried it quietly until the day Dr. Osei opened the folder and the preparation became exactly what it was designed to be. I think about the chair beside his bed, the 4 days of monitor sounds, the paper cup of cold coffee in the corridor, and the phone call I made when the security guard said I was no longer permitted in room 318. The person I called was Dr. Osei. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened. She said, "Come back to the nurse's station. I will meet you there. Do not leave the building." I did not leave the building. Within 30 minutes, the security guard had been told that the restriction request had been reviewed against the patient's documented proxy designation and could not be honored. Within an hour, I was back in room 318 with the folder in my bag and my hand in Daniel's and the monitors making their sounds. He had gotten the calculation right. That is what I keep coming back to. Not the injustice of the corridor or the conversation in the consultation room or Irene's face when she read the addendum. Those things are part of the story, but they are not the heart of it. The heart of it is a man who knew his people, all of them, clearly, and who prepared for each of them specifically, with love and with precision and without telling anyone, and who trusted that when the preparation was needed it would hold. It held. If someone in your life has ever prepared for you quietly, carried something on your behalf without asking you to know about it, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comment. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that love, when it is serious, does the work in advance. It does not wait for the emergency to decide what it is. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.